I'm going to introduce Nick Jordan, who's giving our first talk about the work in Minnesota on clusters. Nick is a faculty member in the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics at the University of Minnesota. He's an agroecologist focusing on sustainability transition processes in agriculture. With Don Weiss, he co-directs the Forever Green Project. So thanks, Nick.
All right, good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm speaking to you from my front porch in St. Paul, where at the moment it's quite a beautiful morning, but we expect it to get very close to 100 degrees, which is kind of all of a sudden for us here. And I am going to try to provide, I'll go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to try to provide an overview of what we are doing at a strategic level in the Forever Green partnership, including our work, of course, with our very integral and treasured partners at the Land Institute around commercializing Kernza. And I want to speak less on a detailed level about the way that we're going forward, and more at a broad and strategic level. And I want to share essentially the big hypothesis that underlies our whole approach. And then my colleagues, Colin, Cureton, and Connie, Carlson, will be providing some kind of more intimate detail of the means by which we're moving that all forward. So I hope that there will be an interesting flow that we'll establish. So the, if I can figure out how to advance my slides. Oh yes, of course. Haven't done this for like a few days, forgot. So of course, everyone knows that the Kernza work is part of a larger project, the so-called Forever Green Initiative, that is developing essentially a bundle of new crops that are both winter annual and perennial in character. And the idea is that these diversify our food system and, very importantly, provide new things for our agriculture and its economy and associated economic opportunities and enhanced ecosystem services. So the Kernza work is part of this broader effort. And an important thing that I want to share about this is that we are trying to develop a public-private NGO partnership to advance crops like Kernza that is based on the shared interests that public, private sector, and the NGO and advocacy sector have in this idea of continuous living cover in the Midwest of the United States. So of course, continuous living cover is a situation in which we have living plants, living roots, living crop canopies across our agricultural landscapes for as much of the year as we can manage. So again, there's a common interest across these three sectors that's very important to what I'm going to be talking with you about. So what are these common interests? The private sector is interested in both new markets, I think it's fair to say, but also in the sustainability opportunities, the opportunities to contribute to the broader sustainability of the world and also the sustainability of their own supply chains. And the public, on the other hand, is interested in continuous living cover, I think most deeply because it provides opportunities to use public funds efficiently to try to obtain public goods from agriculture. What do I mean by that? So public goods from agriculture is a broad concept, but it includes things like climate resilience, climate mitigation, water security. These are things that are largely public interests, and it also certainly includes social sustainability aspects such as justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so continuous living cover, we think, is very interesting because it provides opportunities for public dollars to, for example, efficiently provide enhanced water quality, which has proven to be very expensive when it's undertaken by the public sector outside of the context of new crops. And then the NGO and the sort of related philanthropy interest in continuous living cover crops is that it provides this efficient vehicle to meet the sort of grand challenges that NGOs and philanthropies are generally focused on. So this is related to, but different from and additional to the public sector interest. So the point is, we have this idea of continuous living cover. We have this idea of a bunch of crops that can advance that continuous living cover. And importantly, we have shared interests between public, private, and NGO sectors. And the question for us has been, okay, we want to commercialize these crops. We want to get these crops out there into the world, Kernza in particular. How do we build upon and essentially harness these shared interests between public, private, and the NGO and philanthropic sectors? So that's what I want to share with you. So one thing that we can tell you just sort of at the surface level of, okay, what are we out there doing with, you know, in partnership with public sector, private sector, NGO sectors, we are building supply chains. We are piloting essentially supply chains for Kernza and other crops in which we are trying to answer key uncertainties about these supply chains and in that way de-risk them, reduce the inherent risk. And importantly, we're trying to provide feedback to our R&D efforts. So that's what we're doing sort of on the surface level. But let me, and so that surface level includes very intensive focus, and this is what Colin and Connie will be speaking to after I finish, around some crops that we can think of as sort of the leading edge of the forever green continuous living cover crops. So Kernza, of course, being chief among these, but there are others as well. We are attempting to do this in geographic clusters. So what you're seeing in that illustration on the right side of the slide, encircled in green, are some areas in the state of Minnesota where we are making an effort to develop spatially aggregated little clusters of folks growing Kernza in areas that are actually much smaller than the green circles. And essentially what we're trying to do is to get enough of the crop growing in one place that we can see how well we can move needles, so to speak, around things like advancing ecosystem services related to water. But again, this is just sort of what the commercialization effort looks like superficially. And there's one other aspect of it that I want to share, and then I want to talk about the strategic structure of it, or the underlying strategy. So that other aspect that I want to make sure to point out at the get-go here is that we're trying to commercialize with clear sustainability values in mind. And this is a quotation from a leading farmer in our whole effort, who, these are his words. He said, "I assume we have a clear, articulate vision of what the Kernza promise is." And what he means by that is enhancing social and environmental sustainability as well as economic opportunities. He then asks, what is our strategy to protect that over time, that vision, that full sustainability, essentially dream associated with this crop, Kernza? What options are available to us? And then he says, I know no existing model that we can look to for commercializing something with these sustainability values in mind. And this is a person who's had a lot of experience with organic agriculture. And I think he's speaking to the challenges of scaling up organic agriculture when he says, I know of no existing model we can look to. So I would submit we're going to have to figure that out as we go along, but we have to keep these sustainability values in mind. So with that preamble, let me quickly sketch for you the strategy or the kind of underlying logic by which we're trying to do this commercialization and this learning and this de-risking, but all with sustainability values in mind. And The scheme that we're using, we're calling a scaling system, because it's meant to be a system for scaling up commercialization of these crops with those sustainability values in mind. Importantly, it's a so-called multi-level partnership. Let me explain the model of the world that is motivating this whole strategy. You're looking at a picture, a little cartoon of the so-called multi-level perspective. This is a theory about how change in technologies, such as perennial agriculture is a new technology, changes in technology occur when, in situations where we know that that technology has to compete with some sort of established technology, such as non-perennial agriculture. So what we're looking at is a little diagram that illustrates the three levels that this theory is all about. And it makes the point that most of the time we have these so-called niches that exist in which new technologies, such as a crop like Kernza, are trying to develop. And people, like everyone involved in this conference, is working very hard within that niche and trying to, just sort of get our act together. And this, however, is in the context of a so-called regime. In other words, an established system. And the jargon socio-technical system is used here, which aptly reminds us that there are all kinds of social dimensions as well as technological dimensions to our current agriculture. However, this is in the context of broader trends in what we can think of as a landscape. And this is not meant as a biophysical landscape, but rather as the broader sort of backdrop of trends in the world, such as our acutely sharpened awareness of inequality everywhere in our society, or our increasing awareness of vulnerability to climate change. Those are both quote unquote landscape trends. So the multi-level perspective is a theory about how change in these socio-technical systems happens. And what it says is most of the time, there isn't any change. There's an established regime and it is stabilized. The term locked in is often used by economic interests, by all kinds of social factors, the way that people think and behave together, by a whole complex of politics and power. So there's all these stabilizing factors that, in the context of what we're talking about today, are stabilizing our current agriculture. This is what things in niches like Kernza have to struggle against. However, the multi-level perspective does point out that change does happen in socio-technical systems, and that when it happens, it generally is the combination of two things. One is that the players down in the niche world get their act together and come up with some sort of decent alternative to the current regime. And obviously that is what we are all striving to do with Kernza and with other continuous living cover crops. But the other thing that's necessary is pressure on the regime from the so-called landscape. So in other words, as the inadequacy of our current agriculture, or rather its vulnerability to anticipated climate change, becomes more and more evident, and its massive impacts on water become more and more evident, and on biodiversity, et cetera, become more evident. Pressure is increasingly mounted on the regime, and even though it's a well-stabilized entity, it starts to sort of break up, and there become windows of opportunity. And things like Kernza can then sort of break through, and a new regime can become established. So there's lots of evidence that this sort of episodic change dynamic is very characteristic of socio-technical systems. They're stable, they're persistent, they fight off challenges until they're not, because essentially of the combination of pressure and the availability of a better alternative. So back to what we're trying to do here in the Forever Green system. We're trying to build a so-called multi-level partnership that can drive this sustainability transition that I was just sketching. And what that really the big insight from the multi-level perspective theory is that you have to have both top-down pressure, quote unquote, from that landscape and bottom-up pressure on that regime for change to occur. So what we're saying, as we try to build this scaling system, is fine. We will build a structure that can exert and can kind of marshal and orchestrate both top-down and bottom-up pressure. So that's what this scaling system is all about. And so it's based on some very key things. It's focused on experimentation and learning and refocusing resources that we have. And then most importantly, that combination of top down and bottom up. So that's the sort of big picture, is we're trying to build a multi-level partnership to drive transition in a situation where we know there are these multiple levels of essentially societal functioning, the niche, the regime, the landscape, that we should be paying attention to. So what we're trying to do from a political science point of view, which I am not as a scientist, can be thought of as a polycentric governance network. And just briefly, polycentric governance is when we try to weave together a governance network from all kinds of social actors and institutions. And the challenge is to do this actually well and fruitfully. And I'm going to kind of move through this more theoretical stuff because I do want to have time to focus in on the real guts of what we're trying to do. So I want to use the last couple minutes that I have to sketch for you how this scaling system is supposed to work. That, again, probably the most important thing about it is the way that it integrates and marshals pressure that we can think of as top down, and then pressure that we can think of as bottom up. So the scaling system is based on a bunch of relationships, interactions that we can think of as cross scale, because they occur between parts of the scaling system that are at different scales. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So at the most expansive scale of the system, and playing the role of exerting top-down pressure is something we call the steering council, which is in fact a group of folks that we have just recently convened and now have up and running. That is a group of folks that are that represent public, private, and NGO and advocacy sectors, and their whole job is to figure out a specific strategy by which they can pursue their common interests in continuous living cover crops such as Kernza. And then, once they think of that strategy, pool their resources, which are considerable, and furthermore, get more resources to essentially support the enactment of their strategy. The next level in this multi-level system is something we're calling the agricultural diversification network. And think of this as functioning at 10,000 feet. If the steering council that I just talked about is at a sort of a 30,000 foot level, the network is at more like 10,000 feet. It is all about learning how in the world we manage to commercialize these new crops with sustainability values being observed and kept clearly in sight. So it is all about learning. And so there's an interaction between the steering council and this mid-level of our system that is essentially the steering council has the job of sharing its strategic goals with the network, essentially what it wants to see as a public-private NGO partnership. What does it want to see? What should, say, the outcomes of sustainable commercialization of Kernza look like? How do we make it, for example, equitable? And the network says, okay, well, that's great, and then goes out and, does its work, and or rather the members of the network do, and then comes back and says, well, okay, we see a couple of kind of promising ways to commercialize this crop in a way that for example, prioritizes equity, justice, and inclusion. So that's the kind of back and forth that is critical. Garbage truck is going by. Oh, it's our recycling truck going by on our street. There's another level in this multi-level partnership that we think of as the on-the-ground R&D level, in which we are both developing continuous living cover crops, such as Kernza, and implementing them on the ground. And there's a key interaction between that R&D level and the diversification network that's in the middle that I just mentioned. And that is that folks in these R&D settings are putting these crops out, not just Kernza, but a bunch of others out in the world, trying to advance in scale, putting out the little clusters that I mentioned. And they are experiencing hard-won learning, and they're accumulating experience. And so it's very important that that experience gets shared. What works, what doesn't work, gets shared early and often. And so that's what that double-headed arrow illustrates, is that key interaction. So let's step back and take a look at these interactions. We have, up at the top-down level, we have this network that is articulating at a high level what its vision of sustainable commercialization, that will come up with a new agriculture that meets those lofty public, private, and NGO goals that I mentioned at the outset. We have this middle level that is this platform of intense learning, essentially, about what works to try to make progress towards that goal. And then we have the network, we have the R&D effort down there sort of on the ground as we think of it. We think of it as a sort of engine room of advancing these crops. It is the, well, really the bottom two levels constitute the niche. And so we have a top-down dynamic, we have a bottom-up dynamic. And one very important thing to mention here is that the steering council has this particular role of marshaling resources and using those resources to literally select for what works. In other words, to fund ways of getting these crops out into the world that are successful in meeting its broad goals. So that's an important part of the dynamic here as well. And so, yeah, that's where I wanted to leave this. And Connie and Colin will share lots of details about the actual implementation of work, particularly the sort of bottom-up work of developing these clusters and these pilots, supply chains we're building. But I wanted to put the big picture out on the table as best I could to kind of get the ball rolling. So Lee and everybody else, that's the end of my actual presentation, and let's have a few minutes of discussion if we can.
Definitely, thank you for that, Nick. Just want to invite anyone who wants to submit a question or comment, or if you want to actually talk, submit that on the Q&A button. If you go down to the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A, click on that, type your question there, and we can pass those questions along to Nick, or you can even ask to be promoted and you can speak directly. So to get us started a little bit, Nick, you mentioned that you think that this council is just forming, and you give me some idea of like where you looked for the people to make up this council.
Well, it is formed.
Or is formed, yeah.
And up and running, yeah. And it is a group that brings folks together from sort of mainstream agriculture and also the mainstream environmental groups. It also has a person who's concerned with rural development, who's tapped into the whole network of people in the Midwest who are, you know, working very hard to create some sort of decent future for rural communities across the Midwest. There's, of course, a whole network and a whole sector, essentially. We think that continuous living cover crops, perennial agriculture in particular, has a really big value proposition for rural communities. And so it's very important that that's represented. We have individuals who are part of the whole world of finance, of essentially perennial agriculture as a strategy for dealing with climate change and otherwise providing ecological services, ecosystem services to the world. There's a whole finance sector around that, as folks are aware, I think. And we have individuals who are involved in various levels of formal governance as well. So that's the point, is that it really does embody that public-private NGO mix that we think. And these are all individuals that have considerable perspective and voice and reputation in their sectors. And that's very important to what we're trying to do as well.
So is this to what extent is that group formalized? Are they just, what's the organizational structure or if you will, political structure of that organization? Yeah,
that's a good question. We certainly intend it needs to be egalitarian. It probably needs to be designed using best practices for the sort of co-management of something by a broad group. So we're rapidly learning the key features that are needed to structure cooperation at larger scales than we usually cooperate in this society. Stuff is being learned about how to do that. Drawing on the work of a very famous political scientist named Elinor Ostrom, who is the person who, as a theorist, is responsible for this idea of multi-level structures for dealing with complex problems. And from her empirical work on how people avoid the tragedy of the commons, basically, she figured out these principles of governance that humans have been using for thousands of years to avoid the tragedy of the commons. And if you think about it in a slightly abstract way, one can realize that when you have a group coming together around a common interest that's a very broad group, there's a risk for a tragedy of the commons. There's a risk for certain bad actors to essentially exploit that. And greenwashing by the so-called greenwashing by the private sector is a prime example of that. That's what her governance principles are about. So Lee, those are the tools we're using to sort of structure the steering council. And in fact, we're using those principles throughout this whole structure.
Right, great. Thanks, Nick. We're out of time. We're all clapping for you.
All right, a pleasure. Yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Good, we will move along. Tessa, are you on?
I am. Sorry,
right.
I'm
good.
Juggling things here. So I would like to introduce Colin Cureton. As Supply Chain Development Specialist for the University of Minnesota for Evergreen, Colin supports the commercialization of new perennial and winter annual crops for the upper Midwest, including Kernza, winter camelina, pennycress, flax, hazelnuts, elderberries, and others. His first year on the job is focused intensively on the supply side of Kernza, including UMN's variety releases, seed supply, grower engagement, and supply chain development. He's worked at the intersection of food, health, and ag for about a decade, holds master's degrees in food and energy policy and applied economics, and lives in St. Paul with his wife and 2-year-old son. And we've heard from Colin earlier in this series, so we'd like to welcome him again.
Thanks, Tessa, and hi again, everyone. I'm going to try to share my screen here. See, okay. Audio visually set to go?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. Happy to speak with you again today. Today I'll be talking briefly about our strategy for investing for ecosystem services and sharing economic risk with growers through the Forever Green pilot implementation program. So this is one of the many strategies that is involved in helping those clusters go, so to speak, that you just heard from Nick about. And we'll see how this goes. So I'd like to start with some foundational concepts. My training is in applied economics. And so as many of you know, a lot that's involved in the Kernza world when we talk about, polycentric governance and perennial grains, there's a lot of kind of big think involved. And so the sort of foundation for how and why we should have public resources being invested in commercializing these new crops, there's a long history and rationale for doing so. So we're going to take a quick tour through some basic concepts kind of related to what Nick was sharing there at the end. So public goods, and I imagine, these concepts won't necessarily be new for many of you listening today, but good to review no matter what. So public goods are goods that are both non-rival and non-excludable. So non-rival meaning my use of it doesn't incur on your use of it. And non-excludable means you basically can't stop anyone from using it. So fresh water, clean air are good examples. Public infrastructure like a road, for example, is on the margin, non-rival and non-excludable. So externalities, as many of you all know, if you take Econ 101, it's like markets work perfectly. You take Econ 102 and it's like markets actually fail in all kinds of ways. So externalities are one of the ways in which markets fail. And they are a situation in which the benefits or costs of a commercial activity are not reflected in the costs of the goods or services involved. So we all know, a range of externalities. There are many positive externalities, but we often focus on the negative externalities. Things like climate change is a major one, where the issue that emerges is, not wrapped up in or compensated for in the price of that good. There's the classic free rider problem in classical economics, in which when those who benefit from resources, public goods, or services don't bear their full cost. We'll just get through these quickly. So there's also a classic collective action problem where the aligned interests of the few either establish or maintain a suboptimal use of resources for the many. So this is, if you think up until recently, our main issue relating to agriculture was we didn't have enough food to eat. Well, we invested in a lot of commodity crops, and those commodity crop producers and industry interests are very organized and have been able to maintain a policy architecture benefiting those industries, perhaps at the expense of the public good. And the classic kind of solution to an externality, which often involves the under-provisioning or mis-provisioning of public goods, is that the parties involved in an externality can negotiate to reallocate resources. So I don't mean to make this like a really boring econ class, but that's the classic case for the role of government in mitigating externalities and investing in public goods. And many of you know the concept of ecosystem services, which are the direct and indirect contributions of ecosystems to human well-being. So you could think of it that ecosystem services basically provide a wide range of both private goods and public goods. And I think a major contribution of environmental economics was to realize that basically the entire economy and all of our existence is contingent on these ecosystem services. So that's kind of the big think context. So the case for public investment in Kernza is essentially that Kernza conveys, and other continuous living cropping systems, is that Kernza conveys a number of positive externalities relative to annual row crops, including water quality, soil erosion, and likely carbon sequestration. And also the fact that buyers and consumers are unlikely to bear the full costs of these benefits. And therefore the investment by the public and other beneficiaries that I'll talk about shortly is warranted. So this is all kind of a lead up to talking about what we're actually doing, but I'm kind of laying out the case. And so you see a couple figures here on, this is Bonnie Keeler's work on the social cost of nitrogen. Many of you have probably heard of the social cost of carbon. Dr. Keeler's done some great work on social cost of nitrogen. And there you see a kind of classic figure in early Kernza research demonstrating the significant reductions in nitrate leaching. So the many costs, just to focus on nitrate leaching as one of many externalities, we have the public health costs, as many of you know, involve public health impacts of blue baby syndrome, including respiratory and heart problems, which can be potentially fatal. as well as birth defects and cancer in adults. And just to sort of lay out why Minnesota is choosing to go this route, our rural communities are incurring significant costs to mitigate nitrate leaching. So many are buying farmland and taking it out of production. Some are looking at multi-million-dollar infrastructure costs, like nitrate removal plants are now up and running in, I think, almost at least 10 Minnesota communities. And also some have chosen to go the route of household level nitrate removal systems. So I just pulled a couple quotes from news stories over the last few years that this city is spending millions of dollars to buy sensitive land in their drinking water protection area and setting that aside, taking it out of production. These communities have chosen to, at a cost of over $3,000 per household, install nitrate removal systems. And these communities have spent multi-million dollars on new water treatment plants associated with removal of nitrates. So the case for public investment here is that these costs are real, and a lot of rural communities are struggling, trying to sort out how they are going to work their way out of this issue. I talked to one local community that noted that part of their public health strategy for pregnant families is the distribution of bottled water, because they simply recommend that anybody pregnant or with young children in the home don't drink the water in their community. So it's a pretty dire situation. I also want to take a quick glance at history for how new crops are commercialized. So there's sort of the technological route that assumes or supposes that we're going to develop new crops. They're going to, have some clear benefits and people are going to adopt them. It doesn't necessarily work like that. And so from what I can tell, there's essentially kind of a three-step process by which major new crops are commercialized, and that includes a major geopolitical shock. And I'm kind of contrasting here soy and Kernza. I'm not suggesting that Kernza is the next soy, but it's kind of interesting to think through that humans are unlikely to make significant changes in what they're doing unless they have to. So soy, that was World War II, and soy had been around for over 100 years, was largely a forage crop. And then basically the government and some significant industry interests massively invested in it to advance breeding efforts, but also roll it out on the landscape and increase production. So I would posit to you all that we have some major geopolitical shocks going on. None of you are unwise to that, and that suitable new crop technologies are increasingly available. We're not quite there yet. And so this role for massive public and private investment is really important. And I would say that we're about here. I would actually nudge that up a little bit. I think that's a formatting issue. But we're developing those solutions, and we're now starting to roll out how can the public invest in the scale up of these cropping systems to address these geopolitical shocks we're experiencing. So, okay, enough lead in. So the context here is that in 2019, the state of Minnesota, for the first time, invested $500,000 in the implementation of forever green crops to be spent over 5 years. And leadership and our partners determined that the first wave of that implementation should focus on the commercial scale up and success of Kernza, as that is really the leading edge of our portfolio of crops. And the rest of 2019 and early 2020 has involved developing a detailed plan for that program in partnership with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. In early 2020 to now, we are developing that program and launching it as soon as possible. And I'll be providing an overview of the mechanics and rationale for that program. So the goal of the Forever Green Pilot Implementation Program is to support the commercial scale-up and success of Forever Green crops, starting with Kernza, focusing particularly on the MN Clearwater variety, with a rough goal of converting about 1,000 to 1,500 acres into Kernza production, and to concurrently maximize water quality benefits of early commercial Kernza production, focusing on drinking water supply management areas, or DWISMAs. And importantly, basically everything we're doing with Kernza at Forever Green, the idea is that we are prototyping a model for de-risking and commercializing other Forever Green crops. So you all know we're working on a dozen or more perennial and winter annual crops and cropping systems. So how do we prototype a model to get back to what Nick said, to rapidly, sustainably commercialize these new crops. So ideally, we're going to be seeing more Kernza being produced with more success, maximizing those benefits, providing more adequate support, and trying to reduce or minimize on-farm market failure and risk essentially being taken by growers unilaterally. So our strategy, I won't go over in great detail, but it very much connects back to the cluster strategy that you just heard from Nick Jordan about. So this program will be launched in those clusters. So we have kind of a geographically bounded area. And the main strategy here is to share risk with growers and invest in those growers for ecosystem services that they're delivering to society. We also want to make sure we're providing appropriate technical assistance and other forms of targeted support, like around market development, and ultimately supporting those clusters to develop production, supply chains, and markets in partnership with our local actors and those communities. So actually getting into what that involves, about half the budget, $500,000 budget, will be targeted to grower payments, broken down, and I'll go into greater detail on this, broken down into ecosystem service payments and economic risk payments. We've targeted the bulk of the remainder toward professional services, which mostly means technical assistance. So to have some people based in those clusters, as well as centralized to support agronomic best practices, to facilitate some of the activities of those clusters. And then we have some modest other expenses around convening and travel, et cetera. So to get into the grower payment model, we went this route to basically recognize that the two core aspects of what we want to do here with Kernza and other forever green crops is to compensate growers for those ecosystem services, those public goods, as you heard earlier, that even the well-intentioned members of society may be kind of free riding on a little bit, to compensate growers for those full benefits that they're delivering, and very importantly, to mitigate or minimize risk that they're undertaking. And you want to be careful about doing that so that you're not over incentivizing something. Classic idea in economics is you can sort of subsidize something to death. But in this structure, we have determined that we would be compensating growers a variable rate between $25 to $50 per acre this is a 2-year cycle. So for 2 years for planting Kernza, and I'll get into the details a little bit later on when these payments actually roll out. And that range will actually be based on modeled reduction in nitrogen loss using the nutrient tracking tool, which I know a lot of tools, geographically specific and generalized, are in development to do much more site-specific modeling of nitrogen loss. But at the moment, nutrient tracking tool is the best thing out there, I think, that we have found. If you have other ideas, please let us know. And that we would also compensate a bit additionally for those Duisma acres to really demonstrate that that's a priority. But importantly, this program is not restricted to Duisma acres, which there are about 300,000 Duisma acres in Minnesota, and about half of those are in annual row crop production. And for economic risk payments, you can basically think of this as partial crop insurance, given that crop insurance is not available, at least in Minnesota or anywhere else that I know of, for Kernza. And so we will essentially compensate growers up to about half the cost of production if on-farm or market results fall below the cost of production. So if you get a payday in the market, you're not also getting a payout on, partial crop insurance. And we'll be using a standardized crop enterprise budget using 2020 county level cropland rental rates from Extension. And maybe I can address during Q&A how we arrived at these numbers. It's a combination of, trying to do the best job we can, looking at the value of those services, but also those ecosystem services, but also the political feasibility in terms of acreage covered and what growers will, feel is appropriate, or will at least, give them some comfortability to jump. So your question might be, how much will grower payments cost in year one? So a big challenge here is when you have things like variable payments and payments under certain conditions, you have to make sure you have enough money in the bank in case everything goes south. So the answer is, it depends. And we ran some scenarios to assume that, say, in the first year, 15 growers are involved. They, plant somewhere between 20 to 60 acres. We've randomized the ecosystem service payments, a couple of other assumptions about who's going to need a payout on the economic risk side. And then I ran that scenario 30 times and took some averages and showed that we're roughly on track to be, we're definitely on track to be within budget. So the point here is to say that we've conservatively designed the program such that, if everything tanked, if we were giving maximum ecosystem service payments and had to also make maximum economic risk payments, we would still be within budget. And hopefully that's not going to be the case. A quick note here just to say that we found it important to make sure this program is not only restricted to those Duisma acres. And a challenge was, if we do that, are we going to end up sending all these resources to non-Duisma acres? But we found that our model of local partnership with soil water conservation districts and otherwise have actually been pretty effective. These numbers have shifted around a little bit since I made this slide, but what we see now for current and 2020 approved plantings are that about half of our commercial Kernza production acres will be in Duismas in 2020, which is a not insignificant feat. So just to show the kind of geographic bounding of these clusters, we thought of them early on as kind of, rough areas. When you develop a program, you have to kind of develop some hard boundaries. So here, these are the counties identified in those clusters. The next couple slides, I'll just kind of breeze through quickly. We've, developed some terms for the growers that will be eligible. We intend to grandfather in active commercial stands planted before 2019, or so stands in 2020 that are in their first 2 years of production will be eligible to participate. We're in the process of developing technical standards for this program, which I won't dwell on in great detail. The way this will actually work is that we're thinking of those ecosystem service payments rolling out essentially in the spring following the first year of planting. If you reach the spring and that living root is still in the ground, then you have delivered a valuable continuous living cover ecosystem service, and we intend to pay out for that year between the spring and harvest time. And then economic risk payments will will provide up to 1 year, given that a lot of people early growers will be harvesting and holding product on farm and then getting it processed and moving to the market. Will have about a 1 year period allowing for the economic risk payment to be rolled out. We can't have a grower come to us 5 years later and say, okay, I need a payout on that, So we think 1 year will be sufficient. I won't go into this in detail, but it just kind of shows that developing a program like this for a perennial grain is quite complicated when you think about the phasing of how new stands will overlap with existing stands. And we expect that it will be probably in this 2021, 2022 year where our costs are the highest, because we'll have our earliest stands aging out and two new years of production phased in. So it just kind of shows, this red line will be moved up actually a little bit, but just kind of shows it's a complicated thing. You have acreage increasing, you have some going out of production, some coming into production. And so making that all work economically can be a little bit of a challenge. Also, we're thinking very carefully about our contracted services or technical assistance process. So working with clusters and building capacity in clusters has to translate to our actual, how we make our investments. So we can't just centralize all our resources. We're thinking about how we decentralize some of these resources for technical assistance, working with growers in the field, and how we facilitate those clusters, how we develop markets and supply chain has to be in partnership with those clusters, but it gets complicated pretty quick. And I'll just get to the end here, just to note a few challenges. In launching this program, some of the challenges we're finding, all can be navigated, but it's worth sharing for any other state that's thinking about doing something like this. One is finding that sweet spot of mutual interest. So we have growers who are seeking to mitigate risk and develop a commercially successful crop. And then we have a wide range of partners that's really interested in those ecosystem service benefits. So how do we find the sort of sweet spot intersection, the middle of that Venn diagram? And an example of that is that duismas account for, there's a lot of emphasis on duismas in Minnesota, but they account for less than 1% of Minnesota agricultural land. It's maybe a couple 100,000 acres out of 20 million acres. And then if you really focus on vulnerable or impaired duismas, we're really excited to see Kernza launched, and you can look at that map where these duismas are. And if we have a number of color-coded maps that show, where the vulnerable duismas are, and it's, as you might expect, where we're launching Kernza. It's in the Central Sands region, Southwest Minnesota, and Southeast Minnesota. So those vulnerable impaired duismas account for 0.1% of agricultural land. And so how we launch a new perennial grain on the most environmentally sensitive lands is quite a challenge. And oftentimes your early adopter growers are not always located in those duismas or within target clusters. So you have to balance a lot of different priorities. And then even once you are able to do that, you need to develop this whole program and launch it. So there's technical standards, grower contracts, contract between the state and the university, the management and administration of that, monitoring of it, and essentially making it all go. So our next step is that our next steps, we're currently developing our communications material. We're in the process of writing TA and contract descriptions to get those executed, all with the intent that this will launch this fall. We've sorted out our process between the state and U of M, but are in that process of developing technical standards and grower contracts. Then we'll need to enroll growers and administer the program and monitor it. So it's no small process. And I breezed through a lot of that. One of the hard things about these presentations is everyone else is muted, so you can't tell how it's going, or everyone's with you. But I'll end there, and Lee, if you or others have questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Yeah, we do have some questions here.
Okay.
Let me start with one from Carmen. Is there a formula or rationale for the per acre compensations for ecosystem services? In other words, would this be a number to use on into the future?
I would call this importantly, it's a pilot program. So we arrived at that number through a couple routes. One is that when you look at emerging ecosystem service markets for both water quality, but also say carbon sequestration, I think state of California launched or arrived at in its carbon market, they're roughly around $15 per ton of carbon sequestered. That's where Nori is, I think, initially launching. But also, it's quite frankly, I would say the rationale is a little more for what growers are both used to seeing, but also find matched with that economic risk payment. We'd be investing or offsetting up half or more of the cost of production if everything went south, and still delivering that ecosystem service payment. But it's really about the trade-off between how many acres we can convert to what's a valuable investment. So we've heard from the some of our partners within the state agencies that there are some legislators that will look at the budget. They'll say, we gave you $500,000, and if you invest $100, it very well may be that the ecosystem services delivered are more valuable. But the further up we crank that, there's an inverse relationship essentially. The further up we crank the per acre payment, the fewer and fewer acres we can cover. And so we'll turn around to the legislature and say, we paid for 200 acres of Kernza and it cost $500,000. They'll say, there's no way we're going to expand this out further. And it kind of goes back to what a grower would be comfortable seeing for something like a cover crop, or a CRP payment, first time cover crop user. So I know that's less than perfect, but it's kind of that balance between considering what emerging ecosystem service markets are paying out on some of these ecosystem services, as well as the political feasibility.
You mentioned crop insurance, and I don't know if you know the latest on this. I certainly don't. I was contacted by people from Federal Crop Insurance to talk about developing the ability to eventually get to the point of having Kernza as a crop that could be insured. You know any more about that?
Yeah, I know. So Carmen just asked a question. We've had been providing him and his insurance agents all of the information we have to date on the 2019 production year. My understanding, and Tessa could correct me if I'm wrong, is that they need 3 years of detailed production data of commercial production in multiple regions or multiple areas of a region to put out an insurance product for that new cropping system. That's my understanding, meaning that, you know, we're a couple years off from that happening, but it's in process. Tessa, do you have a comment?
That's also my understanding, is that you need 2 to 3 years of data on like yields and pricing, and then you also but that I had another point, but I can't remember. Anyway, yeah, that's my understanding basically. And I think we are kind of trying to get to that point where we have that kind of data available, and it's done on a county by county basis.
Yeah, and so exactly there, you have multiple years of production data at the county level, right? So I think it's a long time until we have generalized insurance strategies. And I think I should say that this being a pilot, the idea is that pilots can bridge to local and state policies, and local and state policies can bridge to federal programs. So I think the sort of the long range is, you know, a number of people have said, well, we can't build in payments for these crops forever. And it's like, well, we've been paying for other crops forever to respond to our public needs, right? Which for a long time were hunger and, you know, rural economic development. So it makes perfect sense to me that it doesn't mean, again, that you subsidize something to death, but we need a whole new public priorities, and we need a new set of public policies derived from a new set of priorities to respond to the current challenges, right? So it's not a particularly revolutionary thing to say. It just means the priorities have changed, and I do think that Kernza and other continuous living cover cropping systems are positioned to move into that, but it will take a number of pilot programs, state pilots, federal pilots, to achieve that formal status long term.
Great, thanks, Colin. That was a great talk.
Thanks,
Very helpful.
All right, so our next presenter is Connie Carlson. She's a market development specialist for the University of Minnesota's Forever Green Initiative. So she's the third Forever Green person this morning. Her work is to support and facilitate ongoing market development for the range of crops within the Forever Green Initiative's portfolio. She's working closely with the University of Minnesota researchers, breeding and testing new crops to build connections and market opportunities for growers, processors, and businesses seeking to incorporate these Forever Green Initiative innovations. Her work is funded by the Walton Family Foundation, and she comes to the Forever Green Initiative with 20 years of professional experience in product development, strategic sales, marketing, and communications. She currently serves as the president of the Sustainable Farming Association of Minnesota.
Great,
hey, Connie,
thank you, Tessa.
Connie, your presentation just went from presenter to notes.
Okay.
When you did that.
Okay. I'm gonna stop share real quick here.
That looks good.
Okay. Great. Hello, everyone. My name again is Connie Carlson, and I am part of the team that you have just had the pleasure of a meeting with Nick Jordan and Colin Cureton. My work is very much focused on that end use. So who are the people who want to work with Kernza, who wants to work with the other crops within the Forever Green Initiative, and connecting and working with them to get what they need to take these crops out into the commercialization realm. So today, of course, I'm going to speak specifically about Kernza, and I suppose that many of you have had the opportunity to taste or maybe even work with Kernza. So we know that it is a crop that you know, it can be used, eaten, and is moving beyond this proof of concept. We know that it can be made into pastas and breads and cookies and grain bowls, and of course, beer, which has been a very popular way to use Kernza as of late. And I highlight Patagonia here because they're really a great example of the partners that I and my other partners work with to identify as long-term partners in this work and bringing Kernza into the commercialization. Patagonia has been committed to Kernza, working with it in their product development, but also importantly, carrying that message forward of what Kernza is. I think Colin and Nick, exemplified it quite well. And I think many of the presenters over the last week have also showcased what this crop might be able to do for our environment and social and other opportunities. So Patagonia is a company that I like to look at as a model for the companies that we hope to work with. And why is Patagonia interested in working with us? Well, we know about those ecological services, but we also have seen this pretty exciting shift in consumer values and what consumers are looking at when they make their decisions about products that they want to purchase. About 5 years ago, Deloitte put out this consumer value driver plate, is how they're calling it, that showcases, on that left side in the gray, the traditional values that consumers look at, of course. We all look at price, taste. We want it to taste good, and convenience. But what has also been exciting to watch is the shift towards additional drivers around health and wellness, safety. Safety includes pesticide use, social impact, and experience. So these are all additional drivers for consumers and the decisions they make around whether or not they're going to purchase a product. And then, of course, around this whole circle is this idea of transparency, which is tied to trust and that sourcing idea. And this is a trend that is continuing. So in the last 2 years, a group called the Hartman Group, which provides a lot of retail consumer research to organic and natural food companies and stores, retail stores, have been watching consumers as well and kind of capturing the trends there. They have these core consumers who they watch because they really are the harbingers of the trends. And what's interesting is that consumers are moving beyond organic, in that organic is not their highest idea. And so they're looking deeper into farming and production practices and this social, and really continuing to drive that conversation around food. And just recently, that same company, the Hartman Group, released this Organic and Beyond 2020 report, which dives even deeper. And now these reports that Hartman puts out, they're quite expensive, so I don't get to access them entirely, but I have a friend in the retail food industry who's kind of supplied me with some of this. And what I want to pull out here is that in this report, there is a real significant stress on soil health, which I find exciting to know that our consumers are beginning to really identify soil health as a key driver for their decision making. And it's also exciting to see, regenerative agriculture on that list, biodynamic farming, permaculture, some of these production practices and things that have been around for a long time, but maybe have not had that emphasis in the consumer market. And now the consumers are interested and making decisions based on it. And again, it's not going away. Late last year, New York Times put out this article about food trends for 2020. And they said food that is good for the planet and good for workers will be big in 2020. So it's continuing. And we see it translated into our partners' public statements. General Mills is a great example. They have publicly committed to being partners in mitigating climate change and have put out real goals on mitigating that. And I always like to show this slide because here's that soil health story. So they recognize that this is what consumers want to hear and see. And this is a food company that put a big chunk of soil and a big worm on their blog to really show that soil health is part of their vocabulary and the work that they are doing to develop products that consumers want. And I'll just say that this is from a tour that the General Mills employees went out to the Breadcrits farm in Redwood Falls, Minnesota. The Breadcrits are real leaders in soil health education, and the story of their farm is quite impressive. So it's exciting to see that farmer General Mills connection. And Kernza has this story to tell. So we know from the last week and all of our research that it is a soil health crop. It's a water nitrate crop. And so the story is transparent, it's real, and consumers get it when we talk to them about it. You have seen this a few times over the last week, and especially with Colin and Nick's presentations, but this is the story we can tell with clean water and soil health, and working in these cluster areas specifically to drive this story. And I'll be forward in that a lot of my work is identifying partners and market opportunities within those clusters, but my work also takes me statewide, nationally, and excitingly, some international opportunities in the last few months. So my work really is focused on how we grow this ecosystem of commercial partners, and we do it through this near, mid, and long-term relationship and use and product development. So essentially, how can we foster more innovation, food partners, partners in this commercialization, people that are like Tracy, who's in the middle of this piece here, Tracy from the Birchwood restaurant, who has had Kernza on her menu for many years and has been communicating this message that we've all been researching about the benefits of this crop and educating consumers about how they can select it as something that they add to their pantry shelves or that they select off the menu when they go to places like Birchwood. And we also have other partners. Doug is the Kernza cracker person on the right here. And we have Bakersfield, who's been milling and distributing Kernza for a long time. And so my work, specifically focuses on communicating that value proposition. I identify and target and outreach additional industry. I work with people to quantify that market value and industry partners, getting that feedback that Nick talked about, and then supporting all of this work through real tangible applied work. And what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides is a specific strategy around samples. So getting Kernza, Minnesota Clearwater mostly, into the hands of the people who want to work with it. So we can create that feedback loop, that investment, and that motivation to use Kernza. And I've added a recipe here from Beth Dooley, who's been a culinary professional, who's worked with us extensively over the last year and a half to help us continue to understand how Kernza, how people respond to Kernza, how it can be used, and partnering in that way. And I'll do a quick shout out here to the Artisan Grain Collaborative, which is a Midwest organization who's also been a wonderful collaborator in a lot of the small grain work. So where we are and where we want to be. This is the near, mid, and long-term strategies that we have in place. So where we are right now in this development is we are identifying partners that have the ability to immediately integrate Kernza and have either on-site processing, or that the way that they would use the grain would have minimal processing. And so, right away, brewers and distillers are a great early partner for our work right now. And we're working with these early adopters, and these core customers are really the people that we are communicating with directly and meeting their needs. Right now, we still have very small scale product availability, but we know that there's more coming. And we have a limited supply chain, but I'll have to say that the supply chain that's in place now is dramatically more efficient and better than it was even a year and a half ago. When I first started working with Kernza and the Forever Green, people were lugging tote bags between their car trunks and dropping things off, you know, on a one-by-one basis. So the fact that we have, you know, trucks and tote bags and partners in place just shows that we have this supply chain developing. We are moving towards this increased supply. We know that we have a harvest coming up, but then we have a potential for much more. And in that, you know, hopefully maybe in the next year and a half, we'll see increased ingredients on the market. So more flour, possibly malting that we have. We saw, we listed George and Christopher Abbott last week about their malting work. And of course, then improved supply chain, and I want to say supply chains. So in the midterm, hopefully we will see more supply chains, more small scale processing. So not just on site, but separate entities that's their business. They are processing and co-packing, and being able to walk into your local grocer and see some retail presence. So some CPG, consumer product goods on the shelves with Kernza. And in that long term, you know, what we hope to see in a few years is, because of that consistent supply, we have larger partners online, we have more efficient supply chains, an expanded national presence, and, you know, of course, established brands and markets and products. So very specifically, what I have been working on recently is getting samples of Kernza into the hands of the people who want to work with it. And so spurring that innovation to happen in several market channels. And in order to do that, we actually had to line up a lot of elements to make sure that it was a efficient process. And so just very briefly, I'd like to go through a quick checklist of the pieces that we put in place so that we could even just get Minnesota Kernza, Minnesota Clearwater into the hands of brewers and bakers. We, of course, had to have a current supply. First and foremost, I had to have grain. And that happened because of the harvest that we were able, you know, this last harvest, but also because of Sprout Labs. They came on and hold that inventory. They package and ship it and even invoice for me. So it's a valuable partnership that ensured that I didn't have to have a bag of grain in my office that I scooped stuff into and shipped it off. It's professional, it's tracked, and it really shows that we are building the foundation for a distribution of Kernza. Of course, my work is all about tracking who we are working with, and so I've been building a database of contacts across the market chains from and the market channels from, you know, brewers and distillers and bakers and millers. Developing messaging so that as we work with these contacts, that they have the best information they can about a lot of the research you're doing, the benefits of Kernza, etc. I'm particularly excited about this line, the characterization and functionality information. Our partners, our commercial partners, AURI, Agricultural Utilization Research Institute, has put together some sheets that show how Kernza can be used in baking and distilling, and I'll show you a snapshot briefly of that. We have developed this materials transfer agreement because we are moving Kernza grain, university IP product, into the hands of entities. This MTA simply states that the people who use this grain will be not using it initially as a commercial. It was only for product development. We also have NDAs in place, so are available. So as companies are working with this crop, if they want us to remain or some confidentiality remain around it, that we have that contract. Of course, we are going to track and follow up with all of the entities we work with. And lastly, an idea around future supply. So one of the big questions we get from companies is, okay, I've worked with this, I like it, but how am I going to get it, consistently, safely? And so Colin and his work around tracking acreage and working with growers to understand our supply is a critical part of all of this work. So here is those spec sheets that I talked about with AURI. I'm very sorry about the microscopic print, but these should be released very shortly. And they are, again, these kind of recipe cards that people will be able to use in baking applications or brewing applications to really understand the specs around, and I should say the characterizations, the protein and the other content of Kernza, so that they can initially think about how they want to incorporate it into their product lines. So I will go briefly through some of the channels and markets that I've actually been working with and provide you a little insight into how they're responding as they get the grain, and even provide a little bit of insight into what's happened in the last few months around COVID, because it has, in some cases, provided some great opportunities, in some cases slowed things down. So craft brewers have always been kind of on the top of the list for a market channel that is kind of ready to go. They're able to incorporate Kernza into their brewing quite readily. Many craft brewers are already working with whole grains like wheat, and so they have a working knowledge of how to use those grains. Many of them already have equipment on site, and they work with customers who are looking for good stories, new flavors. And so they really have this base of audience that would find and do find Kernza exciting. And brewers have come to us asking for grain. And some of that's because of those ecological services, and otherwise, and some of it's because their customers are saying, hey, when are you going to get Kernza beer? So unfortunately, over the last few months, work with brewers has slowed considerably because many of them have had to shift or close temporarily, and they really don't have the space in their and margin in their time to do some experimentation. But I suspect over the next few months, as things sort of lift and ease, hopefully, we can continue those conversations again. And upcoming activities will be very focused on how we can move that malting into the craft brewing world. I want to highlight a great example of what it's like to work with brewers in that southeast cluster. We have a very engaged group of folks. Imminent Brewing is the brewer, and they've been working closely with the Cannon River Watershed Partnership around building awareness for Kernza. And so they hosted a beer tasting late last November, talked about Kernza, taught local brewers how to use Kernza, and then and selected one of those local brews to be on tap, and hosted another event with a kind of a dinner and a movie to continue that conversation around Kernza. And as a result, we have Kernza Clearwater Revival on tap at Imminent Brewery. I haven't been down there recently, so I don't know how much they have, if any, at this point. But what's exciting is that this was a community-based project. It had local messaging around the value of Kernza, and it had tangible outcomes. We are going to see increased acreage. We are seeing infrastructure investment, leadership advocacy, and new consumer products coming out of this role that these local partners have developed. So craft distilling has a very similar consumer base. Again, there's quite a few in Minnesota. And craft distillers often use more grain. So they're an exciting partner to continue to work with. They were deeply impacted by COVID. I have worked with about five distillers, and they all shifted over to hand sanitizer in the last few months. And so I've kind of held off from communicating with them recently. But as things again start moving, we'll be communicating with them and continuing to move samples and have conversations with them. You can see this barrel that I'm standing next to is Kernza whiskey that is being aged by Tattersall. They're in Minneapolis. Tattersall used 900 pounds of Kernza to make that barrel. So there's some nice potential in working with them. And again, they're interested in that story and the opportunity that Kernza provides for their business as well. Surprisingly, in COVID time, I've made more connections in restaurant and food service. And it continues to be around this, those ecological services. There's a great interest in that. And what was interesting is that some of the chefs and culinary professionals I work with, because of their shift in time availability, they had a little different time to think through menus and develop recipes and work with the grain. So there's a few people who've even added it, you know, or are considering adding it to their menu in the last few months. We also are looking at restaurants and food hubs as a place for educating culinary professionals around growing, working with Kernza. So we are in conversation with developing classes for culinary professionals to use the grain. And surprisingly too, bakers have been a market channel I would not have expected to come out or during COVID as being a good partner. But again, because of their shift in time availability, some of them just had more time to play with Kernza. And I highlight Dargent Bakery here with Anne. She worked with about, I believe we sent her about 10 pounds of Kernza, and she made several batches of bread, baguettes, and blending it and working with it, and provided some really great feedback on her working with it and her interest in using it going forward. So we're continuing to work. This is a little bit longer term, but bringing a CPG to the marketplace, bringing some consumer packaged goods. We are in conversation with some smaller companies who are interested in doing this, developing possibly a pancake mix or a waffle mix, but pizza crust, granola, crackers, they're all great applications for Kernza in the midterm. And we continue to identify those folks and take them along in the process. Many times what I'm hearing from this group of folks is that they're just very concerned about consistent supply. And so once we really understand that consistent supply, where they can source it, and then of course that pricing conversation, I think we'll see a lot more adoption of Kernza into some of these CPG companies. And lastly, throughout all of this, you know, we are, as you can see, focused on these small to mid-scale opportunities, but long-term, we continue to reach out to national corporations, companies that are interested in Kernza, like General Mills has indicated. So there have been a number of conversations that we've had over the last few months, and supply and samples have been going out. So these are long-term conversations. These national markets will really need that consistent supply, but we've been seeing some nice movement there. So just as a conflict of interest statement, I just want to let you know that that I did grow up on a farm that is currently growing Kernza right now. Carmen has been mentioned a few times today, but this relationship is reviewed and managed by the University of Minnesota in accordance with its conflict of interest policies. And lastly, I promise this is the last slide, none of this work would be possible without these funders. So this is a big shout out to Walton Family, Forever Green, and Greenlands Blue Waters, and of course the Land Institute for all of their support. With that, any questions? I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Connie. Really appreciate that talk. It's very informative.
Good.
This is the part that I missed the most about the real Kernza meeting, where we actually got to taste the bread and drink the beer. So it's a real bummer this year. Hopefully next year we'll be back together.
Oh yeah, we'll have lots. We'll have lots to bring too.
Awesome. I do have a question from Claire. Are there end users or buyers who are willing and interested in purchasing transitional or not yet certified organic Kernza? And what about conventional? Do you think that herbicides should be approved in the future?
Yeah, so yes, in fact, some of the distillers were very interested in just getting quantities of grain. So we are seeing that for some markets, they want to just work with the grain. They want to see how it operates, what it tastes like, how their customers respond to it. And then I think there's a real debate out there around the herbicide and the pesticide approval. And that dialogue is really focused around, how we open up that market. And so as someone who comes from, an organic background, my preference would be to continue to emphasize that organic side. But I think that when we can provide the tools for farmers to expand their acreage and possibly, continue to learn how to use different production practices, I think that's an opportunity there. So yeah, I think there's a dialogue that's going to continue around that herbicide-pesticide conversation.
Great. Give a second to see if there's any more questions, but we're about out of time. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
And well, thanks to everyone from Forever Green Initiative. Now we're going to kind of change focus a little bit and move to the West Coast. I'm going to introduce Kalyn Diedrich. She is a third-year PhD candidate in the Soils and Biochemistry graduate group at the University of California, Davis. She received her Bachelor of Science at Colorado State University in Soil and Crop Sciences and her Master's from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in Agroecology and Soil Science. Her work at UC Davis currently focuses on comparing the productivity and soil ecosystem services associated with annual wheat and Kernza cultivation in California.
Right. Do you guys see this correctly?
Yes, it looks good. Go ahead.
Okay. So good morning. Thank you for that introduction. Today, I'm going to be talking about a small portion of my dissertation work at UC Davis that is largely trying to answer this overarching question of whether or not perennial grains can provide ecosystem services in the Mediterranean climate of California, and more specifically looking at Kernza. And I'm doing this work with my two PIs, Kate Scow and Mark Lenby. So just some general questions that I'm hoping to answer during the presentation are, what are my experimental questions? I'll be honing in on a few specific questions, discussing some preliminary findings for the 2018 and 2019 growing season, and then briefly touching on what lies ahead. So first and foremost, why are we doing this study? Currently, we do not have a lot of information on how Kernza performs in the state of California. We are in a Mediterranean climate, which means that we have very warm, mild winters. Our rain is coming from October to March, and we have very hot, dry summers. And just kind of knowing some basic information about this crop, we were curious about kind of how it would perform in this type of climate. And then taking it a step further and actually wondering what its grain and biomass yield potential is in this area. There's also been no formal control for the effect of tillage in field studies when observing soil ecosystem services in Kernza versus annual wheat production. And what I mean by that is when we're looking at ecosystem services, trying to understand or disentangle the effect of perennial root presence versus the lack of disturbance, or the combination of both. And I'll be talking about how we address that in my experimental design. When I talk about soil ecosystem services, what I'm really talking about, at least in the context of our experiment, is the idea of these regulating and supporting services, such as labile soil carbon and nitrogen pools, active soil microbial communities, and soil carbon sequestration. And last, but not least, there's definitely a building consensus, but it's still not entirely clear how annual versus perennial grain cultivation affects soil biodiversity, microbial community composition, and microbial biomass. Sorry about that. So, in order to address these knowledge gaps, we implemented an experimental design in 2018 at the Russell Ranch Sustainable Agricultural Facility. We implemented a split plot design with 4 field replicates, where we'll be looking at this drone image here. Our crop system type is our main plot. So for instance, no-till wheat. And then our irrigation, which is a binary variable, either irrigated or non-irrigated, is our subplot treatment. And then we have nitrogen fertilization, which is our subplot treatment. And we have 0, 50, 100, and 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Our 3 cropping system types are Kernza, tilled wheat, and no-till wheat. And I just want to reiterate, this kind of gets at that second point that I was just discussing in this gradient of trying to understand whether ecosystem disturbance are being driven by a lack of disturbance or perennial root presence or both. That is why we have implemented this kind of gradient of disturbance, if you will, with our no-till treatment. I would also like to reiterate that we are conducting this experiment on a YOLO silt loam. So these are young, deep alluvial soils here in the Central Valley, and they make up almost 150,000 acres throughout the state of California. So as far as our sampling methods, we take total above ground biomass, both vegetative and grain, from every subplot, which are going to be these small plots here indicated in this photo. In the summer of 2018-19, we will continue that for 2020, taking a total of 1 meter squared quadrat. And then we harvest grain as well from every subplot with just a small field combine in 2018, 2019, and 2020. We sample soils post-harvest and post-residue removal. So we are removing the residue off of these plots and then sampling afterwards, and that occurs in October. And we take 1 soil sample per subplot and are only sampling 3 field replicates. In terms of our soil sampling regime, we're sampling from 2 nitrogen treatments. So if we're looking within a given cropping system type and are irrigated and non-irrigated, we're sampling at the 0 pounds of nitrogen down to a depth of 120 centimeters. And then in our 100 pounds of nitrogen, we're sampling down to a depth of 240 centimeters. The reason that we're doing this, we're expecting productivity to be lower in our low or no nitrogen treatments, where in our 100 pounds of nitrogen, we're expecting productivity to be higher both above and below ground. And our questions really are centered around this idea of soil carbon. And as literature emerges, we're understanding how important this kind of subsoil carbon is when we're trying to get a total carbon picture. So especially for a perennial crop like Kernza that has a really deep root system, we want to make sure that we are sampling deep to account for those differences. We are dividing our soil samples into either 15 or 30 centimeter increments, all the way down to a depth of 240 centimeters. But the depths that I'm going to be talking about today are only going to be the 0 to 15, 15 to 30, and 30 to 60 centimeter soil depth. So coming to our first experimental question, is broadly, how does Kernza's above ground productivity compare to till and no-till annual wheat along gradients of nitrogen and water in the Mediterranean climate of California? This picture was taken almost to the day this time last year, where this is our no-till wheat and this is our Kernza on the left. So what we saw was, if we're looking on the x-axis here, we have nitrogen in our pounds per acre. Our 0, 50, 100, and 150, and then on the y-axis is our grain yield in pounds per acre. The irrigated Kernza is our turquoise and non-irrigated is brown. And in 2018, this is our first year, the general take-home message is that we had very low yields with a lot of error. There's a couple reasons for this. Number one being we actually had crop failure and our first seeding ended up having to seed later. And we missed out on a lot of water because of that, and it was also a very warm year. So the plants were just generally very stressed. However, you go to 2019, and we see a very different story. So if we're looking kind of at a general average yield here at 0 pounds per acre, we're seeing that it was around 6 to 8. However, in 2019, it's about 600. So we had a very large increase from 2018 and 2019. Interestingly, if you're looking at the brown dots here, our non-irrigated yields were actually more responsive to nitrogen and just higher yielding than our non-irrigated. That was largely because of lodging. Given that we have this irrigated treatment, we had a lot of lodging occur when we did a late season irrigation in June 2019, which made harvesting very difficult. But this experiment, remember, is in the context of both till and no-till annual wheat, as well as Kernza. So if we're looking at a productivity assessment in that regard, again, we have nitrogen on our x-axis and then grain yield on our y. And I'm going to be sticking with this color pattern where Kernza throughout the presentation should be purple, no-till will be blue, and tillage will be green. And I also have textural differences here indicating irrigation. So our solid lines are irrigated, and then the dashed lines are non-irrigated. So as we would expect, our tilled grain yields were the highest, and then our no-till was below, and then Kernza was lower than the till and no-till yields, with generally being about 25% of the yield of annual wheat. And interestingly, their response was linear, and I think that's largely because, again, our yield hit with the irrigated Kernza. However, when we look at biomass yield, it's a different story. So again, axes are staying the same in terms of the x-axis, but now our y-axis is biomass yield. So this is both grain and vegetative biomass. And what we see is that it's actually Kernza, both irrigated and non-irrigated, have substantially higher yield than both till and no-till across irrigation gradients in terms of biomass yield. And this is really important because when we start thinking about soil ecosystem services, and kind of trying to understand what's going on below ground as a mirror of what's going on above, this is very interesting and something for us to keep in mind. So as just a general productivity overview, Kernza grain yields were significantly lower than annual wheat, but our total above ground biomass was greater than till and no-till wheat in 2019. And while our 2018 yields were indeed low, our 2019 biomass and grain yields were considered comparable to results from other US regions. We've talked about the above ground. I'm going to go below ground and briefly touch on two of our experimental questions. So number one is, does Kernza cultivation result in greater active microbial biomass, labile soil carbon, and soil carbon stocks? I'm only going to be focusing on active microbial biomass during this presentation. And number two, how does Kernza affect soil microbial community composition? So before I go into talking about our results, I just want to briefly talk about how we're measuring this and why. So phospholipid fatty acid analysis, or PLFA, as I'll be referring to it throughout the presentation. Just to kind of recap, phospholipids are an essential membrane component of living cells, and thus they can be used to estimate microbial biomass because viable microbes have this intact membrane which contains fatty acids, which I have a picture of here on the left, where if we have our phospholipid bilayer, we're kind of zooming in here, these saturated and unsaturated fatty acids, for instance. And so PLFA is a chemical extraction process that can be analyzed through gas chromatography. And it gives you these kind of broad fingerprint community patterns. So unlike a more finer taxonomic resolution that you can get with 16S or ITS, PLFA gives you much more broad, for instance, gram-negative, gram-positive, AM fungi. But it does detect changes rapidly, which is beneficial when you have a long-term experiment and you're trying to understand how things are changing over time. And PLFA and many DNA sequence-based methods have been shown to correlate when differentiating microbial communities. And I will bring up why this matters later on in the presentation. So in 2019, here on the x-axis, I have our soil depths that we were talking about, 0 to 15, 15 to 30, and 30 to 60. And this is our total PLFA biomass. So the fungi and bacteria combined together. And as I mentioned, I'm trying to hold true with the colors here of purple being Kernza, no-till being blue, and green being tilled. And what we see is that while PLFA biomass is decreasing with depth, there's really no significant difference between the cropping systems per se. However, I am especially interested in the fungal component of PLFA biomass, largely because they are known to be master carbon regulators, not only because their hyphae can physically aggregate soil and protect it, but as well as compounds that they can exude that help with soil aggregation that can subsequently lead to soil carbon protection. So I want to take a little bit deeper of an investigation here. So on the y-axis, I have just fungi now versus total PLFA biomass, and again, soil depth on the x-axis. At 0 to 15 centimeters, we see that no-till has higher fungal biomass. However, as we go down into deeper soil depths, we're seeing this separation, this clear separation of where Kernza actually has higher biomass. And taking it even a little bit more specific, the well-known bruscular mycorrhizal fungi over here on the right-hand side, on our y-axis, and again, soil depth on the x, we're seeing this clear differentiation where Kernza is consistently has a higher number of AM fungi at every single soil depth. And given our PLFA results and what I was seeing with just this generally higher fungal biomass, I wanted to look at the fungal to bacteria ratio of these three cropping systems at depth. And at 0 to 15, so again, fungi to bacteria ratio on the x-axis, we see at 0 to 15 centimeters, the Kernza and no-till are fairly similar. But again, as we go down and deeper into the soil profile, down from 15 to 60 centimeters, we are again seeing that Kernza overall has a higher fungi to bacteria ratio. So we've talked about biomass, which is what my first question is, but now I want to talk about community structure. So before I talk about this figure, I just really want to briefly talk about how we generated this. So we used a canonical correspondence analysis, or a CCA. And basically what this is just a simple linear regression where we plug in our microbial community data as a response variable, and then our explanatory variables are all the treatments that we imposed on the system. So irrigation, crop type, and nitrogen. However, microbial community data is extremely messy and difficult to interpret, so it actually generates this multi-dimensional answer. And as humans, that's really hard to interpret. So this type of analysis kind of compresses that multi-dimensional answer into a two-dimensional graph that tries to explain these two axes, explaining the most variation in the data. We then can use hypothesis testing, known as the Monte Carlo permutation test, to understand which variables are statistically significant. And that helps us deduce what the axes actually are and which ones matter. And then once you lay the data out, you can kind of visualize whether they're differentiating vertically or horizontally, which axis is which. So for us in 2018 and 2019, both crop type and soil depth were the only significant factors. When we lay the data out, we see that our three crop types, no-till, till, and Kernza, are differentiating vertically. And so that tells us that the CCA2, we can infer that this is likely crop type. And though I'm not showing it because all of our soil depths are combined within this crop type, it is inferred that soil depth is what our CCA1 is. We can calculate the percent variation that's being explained in this data for these axes. And so soil depth is explaining almost 95%, which isn't super surprising. We find this pretty commonly in soil science. And our second axis, which is crop type, is only explaining about 2.25%. I would also like to note that these order ellipses, so these are 95% confidence intervals of where this community composition lies on these axes. The closer they are together, the more similar they are. The further apart, the less similar they are. So in 2018, we're starting to see this differentiation of Kernza from the till and no-till, but it's not substantial. However, we go to 2019 and it's a different story. So again, our axes are the same, our hypothesis test is the same, but a couple things have changed. So our x-axis, or CCA1, has actually decreased. So soil depth is explaining less variation in the data, while our CCA2 is explaining more variation in the data. It's going from about 2.25% to 6.3%. And we're starting to see this clear differentiation between the till and no-till treatments and the Kernza, which is very interesting. So we're looking at crop type, but I have not showed you the soil depth. So one of my questions when I saw this data was, okay, we're seeing this across crop depth, but is it really being largely driven from just one soil depth that this is occurring, perhaps the top 0 to 15 centimeters? So I wanted to look at that crop type and soil depth interaction. And I know this may look a little dizzying, but bear with me. So the axes are the exact same. What we see is that there's a general clustering in 2018 of all of our 3 cropping system types that are 0 to 15 centimeters. And then our 15 to 30 centimeters, remember, this is differentiating horizontally. We're kind of seeing this combined. And then at 30 to 60 centimeters in 2018, we are starting to see a differentiation where the Kernza at 30 to 60 centimeters is not where the till and no-till is. You go to 2019, again, same idea. However, we're starting to see this clear differentiation at every depth. So 0 to 15 for the till and no-till are here, where Kernza is up here, 15 to 30 for the till and no-till, Kernza is here. So we're seeing this clear differentiation in microbial community composition at every depth as we go with time. I would like to note that this 2018 sampling happened about 9 months after we had planted Kernza. So by 2019, it had quite a bit more time in the ground. So as a general overview, we saw that variation among active microbial groups as determined by PLFA were explained by soil depth and cropping system type in 2018 and 2019. We saw that microbial community composition among annual wheat and Kernza are starting to differentiate with time across all soil depths. And that on average, Kernza has a higher fungal biomass at depth than till and no-till annual wheat. So looking ahead for the 2020 season, this is a tool that my lab has generated for this area. And the dark blue line is what our current precipitation is. And the light blue dashed line is our 10-year average. So as you can see, we have a nice substantial gap right now, and we are going to be in a drought year. This is evident in our non-irrigated treatments already this year. So we will be paying close attention to how this is affecting productivity and below ground measurements as well. I'd like to just briefly recap on what we're actually doing next. So we've done PLFA. We're going to take it a step further and try to complement this data and get a lot more detail by looking at the Kernza versus annual wheat microbiome. We got a small grant to be able to look at 16S and ITS rRNA sequencing both in the bulk soil and the rhizosphere of annual wheat and Kernza. We need to finish our 2019 and 2020 soil health analysis, complete our 2020 PLFA analysis, and then we'll also be doing total carbon analysis on our baseline samples taken in 2017 all the way to 2020, and we'll be doing that on a mass balance. And then 2020 above ground biomass harvest, which is already in full swing. And these are just some pictures. This is our grain from last year. And this was our sampling that we were doing for our microbiome project this year. And this is kind of what our Kernza looked like in our no irrigated, no nitrogen, 100 pounds of nitrogen treatment this year. I would just like to thank all of my contributors and funders, the Scow and Lundy Lab, my amazing undergraduate research assistants, Land Institute for seed and project guidance throughout the last couple of years, Russell Ranch for making all of the operations actually happen, and just as well as all of my lab mates for methodology of development and help in the field, and the Ohio State University for soil health data. And with that, I think I can take questions.
Great, thank you for that presentation, Kalyn. It was very informative. We do have time for some questions, so anyone who wants to go to the bottom there and type in the question, we'd be happy to take them at this time. I've got one to get you started. So how does the irrigated area look this year so far?
Good question. Yeah, so our irrigated treatment, there is a huge gradient. It looks much better than our non-irrigated, which we have not seen in the past. That being said, we're also learning from our mistakes last year and trying to avoid irrigating late season to avoid lodging. So in terms of application, we're not maximizing growth, but we are trying to avoid water stress where the non-irrigated systems are definitely experiencing that.
So the irrigation treatment have like the same amount of water as the wheat, or is it different?
Just due to the fact that they're growing at different times and we're experiencing water stress at different times, we have irrigated the annual wheat about 6 inches this year and the Kernza about 8. So it usually gets a little bit more just because of its growing season is longer. It isn't at as high a risk of lodging at the given time of year. But yeah, generally it's around the same amount of water and a little bit more.
So are you in the same stage as that picture you showed last year with the heads emerging?
Yes, yep, that is where we are at now. So I'm wondering if we'll end up harvesting around the same time. I'm thinking we will.
And when was that harvest time?
That was late July last year.
Okay. You're
Yeah,
quite similar to our Kansas timeline. We have heading right now and anthers are just starting to emerge. So I have a couple questions here. Do you expect Kernza to do even better in this dry year that had more early spring water accumulated?
I'm going to say no.
Oh, he says better, I
oh.
mean. This question
Wait, so
follows that. So do you expect, I think, yeah, just talk a little bit about the difference between the years.
Okay. So 2019, we had above average historical precipitation, not only in our concentrated time, but it actually exceeded where we were getting rain in May and June, which is pretty rare. And we had really high Kernza yield. So I think this year it's very evident that we're seeing water stress, and it's also being coupled with really high temperatures. So we have already had multiple days over 100 degrees, and that is just extremely stressful at this time and epidemiologically. So it's going to be a little bit hard to disentangle what is water and what is heat stress. But last year when we had cooler temperatures and more water, it was definitely a lot happier overall.
Question from Jude. Are there any plans to look at the N15 stable isotope ratio of the plant biomass nitrogen? Might be interesting to see if there is more or less dependence on associative biological nitrogen fixation among your fertilizer and species treatments.
Yes, so that's a great question. We actually tried to secure funding to look at that early on in the project and we're unable to do so. But we would love if that was an opportunity. And what this research is ultimately serving as is a catalyst to try to increase research in this general area so that people can ask and answer those exact type of questions.
Great. Question from Tim Cruz. Kalyn, thanks for the great talk. What was planted in the fields before your experiment?
It was, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say it was grassland, which is definitely something that we're keeping into account, especially when we're going to be looking at total carbon numbers. Is this a question of building carbon or avoiding loss? So as we get into our total carbon analysis, if you look at drone imagery, we're surrounded by just a grass field, and that's what it was before. So it will be definitely interesting to see how those numbers change over time.
Second question from him is, what is the background soil organic carbon levels? And do you have carbonates?
We do have low levels of carbonates, and soil organic matter percentage there is about 1.8 to 2%. So it's much lower than the Midwest area.
And a final question from Tim. Are you seeing nitrate leaching in any of those treatments?
So we run ammonium and nitrogen every year on our soil samples, and what I'm seeing is that there is little to no nitrate available in the soil in almost all of our Kernza treatments, which is definitely not the same story for our Tell and no-till treatments.
So there is leaching through the system in the wheat system?
Yeah.
Question from Jess Gutnecht. I'm sorry, I may have missed this, but did you show how your PLFA fungal indicator levels changed with Kernza plantings?
Yes. So overall total PLFA, Kernza was not significantly higher at each depth, but when you looked at purely just fungal, generally below 15 centimeters, the fungal biomass was higher with our PLFA biomarkers.
Right. Good.
Any other questions?
Give a second here, see if anyone wants to get one more question in. Otherwise, thank you, Kalyn.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sorry for getting you up so early this morning.
No worries at all. It's nice to get a good early start on Monday.
Yeah, you West Coast people are suffering for this.
No worries.
So next we're going to hear from the folks at Patagonia Provisions. First, we're going to hear from Christie Biddle, who works on sourcing and supply chain management for Patagonia Provisions. She works with Kernza growers to meet the company's Kernza supply needs for the production of Patagonia Provisions long root ale beers. And then we'll hear from Patrick Horn, who's a manager at Patagonia with extensive experience building and running operations, supply chain, and consumer products goods organizations. He likes to find creative solutions to drive growth and sales and communicate their message to their consumers.
Great, thanks Tessa. Awesome, so my name's Christie, and as Tessa mentioned, I do our ingredient sourcing at Patagonia Provisions and manage our Kernza supply chain. And so I work with all of our growers and cleaners, and as some of you may know, Patagonia and Patagonia Provisions changed our mission statement last year to "We are in business to save our home planet." And our approach to product development is really to find ingredients and crops that we can champion that are solving different issues in the food system and helping to solve the environmental crisis. So we're looking for crops that are helping to build topsoil and mitigate climate change and contribute to our mission. So Kernza has a very natural fit in with our approach to developing food products and our reason for being as a company. So we've been really thrilled to champion it from the start, and we were the first company to launch a commercial product using Kernza. We launched our long root pale ale in 2016, and just last year we launched our long root wit. Having a consistent supply of Kernza has been a challenge in the first few years. I think we are now working with growers in a handful of states, so we're feeling confident in our supply moving forward, and sourcing from different regions that will help to mitigate some of the factors that may reduce yields in one region or another, to give us a really consistent supply to grow our Kernza program. I think COVID has forced us to take a moment to pause and look at our brewing partners as well as co-packers and assess next steps, but we are really excited to grow our program. Our beers currently are in distribution on the West Coast, as well as some regional distribution in Colorado and Texas. But we're excited to both come out with new SKUs and increase our distribution, and are also looking at new applications for Kernza and potential food products. So as the next few months unfold, we'll kind of assess next steps and the direction that we go, but we are really excited to continue growing our program. And I will turn it over to Patrick in a minute here to talk about some of the innovation that we're working on and all things beer. But before he begins, we wanted to show you a quick video that we recently produced that will have some familiar faces in it. So we hope you enjoy that, and then I'll turn it over to Patrick.
Thank you, Christy. Sorry, I'm going to take a minute to try to make sure that I do this correctly. So here we go.
We see you.
You see me. That's great. All right, hold on here. Okay, let me see here. Sorry, everybody. We're all still trying to figure these things. Here we go. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, here we go.
Are folks able to
not
hear the
hearing you.
audio?
No
No.
audio.
And no audio.
So we're not getting any audio here, people?
No.
Mm-mm. Can you hear it on your end?
I can.
It may be helpful to go on the start video icon and click video settings and choose where your audio is coming from.
Okay.
Little arrow.
Would that be in the, here, let's see. Let's do, so the speaker would be probably the MacBook speakers then. Okay, let's try this now.
Still not getting it.
Okay.
Looks really nice, though.
It's beautiful. West Jackson talk is always lovely. Give me one more. Let me try one more thing, folks, and then we will. Maybe we'll send this out to you guys afterwards. Looks like I'm connected. All right. Okay. Let me just try this one more time.
No dice. Still not. Sometimes, I mean, I've been able to just have it play on my end with just the speakers of whatever computer is going, but.
Cultures of nature do not waste away anything like the way we waste away through agriculture. So why not mimic that?
Well, my name is Tim Cruz, and I'm the Director of Research and ecologist. We are working on developing an ecosystem that is perennial and diverse. Those are the ecosystems that build the soils that agriculture depends on. Kernza is a wild perennial that we're bringing out of the wild and turning into a crop. The reason we like it so much is through evolutionary time it developed a very extravagant rooting system. It goes very deep. Those roots seed the soil food web. Those roots take up deep water and nitrogen. When you see a field that has no plants on it and the soil is broken wide open and exposed to the elements, we're accustomed to associating that incredible ecological disturbance with food. But if you put on the ecological lenses, that is an ecological disaster. And it's necessary to till the soil when you grow annual crops. The outcomes of that type of disturbance are soil erosion, loss of soil organic matter, loss of nutrients, and explosion of diseases and insects when you're growing only one species. When you plant perennial vegetation, like Kernza, you reverse that. It's regenerating that ecosystem function.
I'm Brandon Kaufman. This is my family farm. My children are actually fifth generation born and raised here. And I'm here today taking Kernza on onto the commercial scale. In the last few years, I've been really analyzing why we're doing what we're doing, not just the typical, well, that's the way Dad did it. As I started changing things and buying seed instead of herbicide, fungicide, insecticide, my profitability was increasing. And so the diversity played a role, was more sustainable than what we're doing now. So my mindset sort of changed to think holistically, sustainably. So I started diving into polycultures, doing companion cropping with Kernza now. You step back and look at Mother Nature and the tens of thousands of years of R&D that she's put out here. We need to mimic her.
My name is Christian. I'm the founder and brewmaster here at Hopworks Urban Brewery. Kernza is really an amazing perennial wheatgrass. It uses half the water of a typical wheat or barley crop, and Kernza is a perennial grain that lives in harmony with nature. We're using Kernza to make beer in partnership with Patagonia. The two beers we're making currently are pale ale and a Belgian style wit beer. The flavor and profile of Kernza is really unique. It has a nuttiness like wild rice and the spiciness of rye. And I really appreciate what it brings to beer, especially this Belgian style wit, which is known for its spiciness. There's nothing more important to me than the health of the planet, and Kernza has the potential to change the world of food and beverage. I have two kids. I cannot wait to hand the brewery off to them, using beer as a force for good. We're going to create a hope spot with a pint full of delicious beer.
Okay.
Great, Patrick. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Let me turn this off now. Now how do I stop sharing my screen? That's the question.
You already did.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you. Sorry, we use Microsoft Teams for the bulk of our stuff, and so I'm not very familiar with Zoom. So everybody, please accept my apologies. And I did have a presentation or just a quick PowerPoint, but I'm not going to mess with that right now. Just I think I can talk about it, and I could share it with Tessa, and I think then could share it with you guys. So why beer? Well, when we decided to come up with a commercial application for Kernza, beer seemed like kind of a natural application for that. It allowed us to get to market fairly quickly, and it's a product with wide distribution. And so beer was decided on beer. And also beer, beer's a conversation starter. So it's a great way to get people that are unfamiliar with Kernza, unfamiliar with perennial grains, to maybe to think about these things or to be introduced to these things. And that video is another kind of application of us trying to engage with the consumer that doesn't necessarily think about these things. And so we wanted to come up with something nice for them to be able to be introduced to these things. So beer to us is a great tool to teach other people about Kernza and perennial agriculture. And obviously also to grow beer to be able to plant more Kernza. And that's currently what we're doing. So Kernza is currently being utilized in beer making process. So it's being used as an adjunct. And in the brewing world, an adjunct is kind of anything that's not barley. So it could be oats, it could be rye, it could be dextrose, or Kernza. And the way we're utilizing Kernza now is as an adjunct, which means it's more of a body and flavor additive versus contributing any fermentable sugars. And again, during the brewing process, that's what we're doing with barley. Typically, is we're using a modified barley that has been malted for our sugar content for the yeast to be able to ferment and make beer. Kernza currently, as we're utilizing it, is unfermented, and so the carbohydrate chain inside the seed is far too complex for yeast to be able to modify or to digest and turn into alcohol. And so we started looking at ways of changing that for two reasons. One, if we have Kernza that's malted, we can start utilizing more of it. Currently, we're using about 15% of the total grain bill in our beers as Kernza. The rest is either on the wet side, it's predominantly barley and wheat. On the pale ale side, it's predominantly barley. But again, if we had a product that was modified that then could contribute fermentable sugars, we can then up that percentage significantly. You could even, there are even thoughts of maybe going to 100%. So Kernza, unlike barley, is a little bit more difficult to malt, mainly because of its size. That small kernel does not, the way current malting is set up, there are a lot of grates and filtering processes that the holes in the grates are far too large for Kernza. That's one issue. And the second issue is it's never really been done before. And so we've just now started to work with a few malting companies that are using very traditional malting practices that utilize the infrastructure, the malting infrastructure as it's currently in place. We've had a few folks with some proprietary technology and some piloting proprietary technology be able to malt Kernza. The problem with those is it's highly expensive and there's so few of them that to really get this on a much larger scale, we have to really figure it out on utilizing the current malting infrastructure as it is. And so that's what we started to do, and we're working with a couple partners in the Bay Area and down in the Central Valley of California. We're very lucky in the Bay Area to have a couple companies that are, I want to say they're on the cutting edge of malting, but they're on the cutting edge of malting by going kind of backwards a little bit, much like kind of we all are in some ways, and how we're looking at agriculture. So I feel like that's it always feels more comfortable for me. The other way that you can utilize the Kernza in its whole form currently without malting it is through hammer milling it into flour and a brewing process called mash filtering. This is amazing for a technology. It's been around for about 100 years in Europe. It's just starting to really come into the US. The only issue is that it's cost prohibitive. It's a very expensive system. But again, with this technology, you can utilize Kernza once it's cleaned without being malted up to 100% for a grain bill for the beers. It's something we're still looking at, but again, it's probably 10 to 15 years down the road before it really the costs come down and the craft beer side really adopts it. So one of the other issues is around Kernza is the cleaning process. We lose a significant amount of the Kernza during the cleaning process, the dehulling process mostly. If we were able to malt Kernza, we wouldn't have to take away the hull, the outside of the grain itself, which actually allows our harvest per acre to increase significantly, and our costs start to come down through that. And again, that's where we want to keep moving. We want to bring costs down. We want to put more Kernza in the ground, and we want to make it more ubiquitous in the beer market so that other breweries are adopting Kernza into their brewing process. We talked a little bit about the size of the grain. What we're seeing is, especially in these traditional malting processes, is they're able to utilize different mats, if you will, within the kilns and things like that could allow the Kernza not to fall through the grates that they currently have. So they're working towards that. They're working towards really finalizing the germination process, because what we found early on is that it's vastly different than barley in the way it behaves through that process. And so our partners are working on that as well. But unfortunately, all of our projects have kind of come to a little bit of a halt. We were just diving in at the beginning of March to finalize some processes. But again, all of that's been put on hold, at least for the foreseeable future. We're hoping that sometime in the fall, depending on what happens, we can kind of get these programs that we're working on back up. And so to us, the malting of Kernza is really the next step. It's the next step to a utilization within the brewing process and getting more Kernza into the brewing process, which again gets more Kernza into the ground. And then also having it so that during the cleaning process, we're not losing nearly as much Kernza, and so that our harvest is much more efficient and our costs can start to come down, so that again, the vast majority of the craft beer market and brewers can see this as something that's viable for their products. Because again, barley is the vast majority of the fermentable sugar grain that we're currently using in beer. And it has been that way for probably close to 2,000 years. But it's time for the next step. And we feel that, Kernza can really make a big impact here in beer and in brewing with a product that brewers can utilize a little bit more easily than Christian, and you saw Christian in that video, in the way he's utilizing it currently. Christian has been an amazing partner and has really done a lot of work to utilize Kernza as much as he can in the brewing process. But he's kind of hit the ceiling with what can be done. And so we will continue to move down this road to have something that's more commercial. And again, we've been working with Tessa and with Connie and with Colin and Christie in this kind of, we had a meeting right at the beginning of COVID of this kind of new working group around commercialization of Kernza, and they've been really helpful around this process, and will continue to be helpful as we move forward with these projects, hopefully in the fall. So I wanted to say a big thank you to Tessa, and again to Colin and Connie for being the smarter people in the room than me. I'm just the beer guy, so having their input and Christie's input has been really valuable to help drive a lot of these things forward. So with that, I will say thank you to everyone and to those four, and open it up for questions.
Great, thank you both for presenting this morning. We do have one question here to start us off from Claire Keene in North Dakota. What kind of Kernza acres are farmers who grow Kernza for Patagonia planting? 50, 100, what size? The size or depend on logistics or distance from the point of delivery?
Great. Yeah, I would say that for the most part, the growers we're working with have about 50 acres or more. That being said, we have, purchased very small. We've done some spot purchases for even just a couple thousand pounds from folks. So yeah, 50 acres or more, I would say, for the most part. And, I think as we move forward, we're definitely interested in having some more regional cleaning and processing facilities that will help to decrease the logistics. Right now, we've had most of our Kernza cleaned in either South Dakota or Kansas, and we've had it coming from New York and several states, and then ultimately it's going to the West Coast. So building up those supply chains will be a big part of things moving forward, but we're certainly happy to work with growers of all sizes.
Great. Patrick, I really appreciate what you said about trying to get away from having to do the dehulling and the losses that happen there. I think that's really important. Earlier last week, we had on a brewer from France. I think Christophe is his name. And when you talked about the French approach, that's very expensive. Is that what he described to us? Or is that, are you unaware of what he's talking
the
about?
hammer mill and mash filter process?
Yeah.
I unfortunately, I wasn't on that one, but my gut says yes, because in Europe, that process is it's much more ingrained in their brewing practices. So, and it is, again, it's a very expensive front load cost. In other words, the equipment is very expensive. We're talking for a craft brewer size brewery, we're talking up north of $500,000, where normal brewing equipment for craft brewers is usually around $150,000 to $200,000 range. And so he's most likely talking about that process. The good news, the good thing about this process, though, and this is why it's becoming more adaptable in Europe or in America, is once you get that cost out of the way, it's highly efficient. You're using less ingredients, less water, less electricity. So your ROI on that equipment is highly accelerated compared to normal brewing equipment. But again, it's that front load cost that really scares a lot of people off.
A question from Jessica in Minnesota. To speak to the Kernza economics and economic drivers, how are you envisioning marketing Kernza's ecosystem services into the future?
Yeah, we do it mostly by just showing, and Patagonia's always been this way, is we try to make a market for these things, and we'll take on the cost of these initial forays into commercialization. So we subsidize a significant amount of our costs currently for Kernza, and it's economically not great. I'll be honest with you. But what we're starting, and this is again why we're moving towards malting and these other things to make it more efficient and to bring the cost down, so that then we can share that in with the brewing community. And so when we could do that, that's really where we're going to see the actual cost of production come down and the actual cost per pound come down, and make it so that it's something that is economically viable for small businesses. Small breweries are not known to be moneymakers. The sad thing that we're seeing currently in this current environment is we're seeing, I think it's upwards of 30% of breweries are going out of business for good. And it's because margins are tight, cash flow is tight, and so we have to be really sensitive about that. We need to present to them a product that makes economic sense to them, and that's really what we're trying to do. And we're trying to show it that it also tastes great, that it's a really it's a really nice ingredient, and it really is. I've done a lot around the flavor profiles of Kernza in beer, and it really adds just such a beautiful depth of flavor. Christian mentioned kind of a white pepper spiciness and kind of close to rye, and I also it also really adds a beautiful fruitness to beer. And the other thing is just as an aside, is for years, everybody was, brewers, all they cared about were hops. It's been hops all day. It's been, what's the biggest, newest, coolest hop? What's the fruitiest hop? What's the tiniest hop? What's the, and everything in between. And which is great, but now the tide is turning, and brewers are really starting to focus on the grain. Grain used to be this very neutral thing. They didn't want anything from it but fermentable sugars, to kind of keep its mouth shut, if you will, in the flavor profile. And that's changing. We're really starting to see brewers really embrace locally made grains that are heritage grains that are perennial. And so that also, I think, is another factor that is going to help us as we move forward. So I hope that answers your question.
Another question from Jose. Maltster I spoke with mentioned Kernza's small seed size is an issue in malting. I know you talked about this already somewhat. Can you explain why, and is there a workaround to get past the issue?
Yeah, a couple workarounds. So traditional malting during the initial process, the germination process, which is what your initially malting really is. I probably should have explained that, because malting is really getting the seed to start to germinate and then stopping it. once you get a little bit of those sproutlets coming out, and the enzymatic process is starting to really break down the carbohydrates within the kernel itself, and so that normally is done, in big tanks where it gets wet, and at the bottom of those tanks are, just a mesh bottom. The holes on the traditional mesh bottoms are built for barley, which is a significantly bigger seed or kernel than Kernza is. And so the first workaround in those tanks is putting a different false, what we call false bottom in the bottom of those that has a smaller grade. The second thing is when they're germinating it outside of those tanks, again, a lot of facilities are using grates to hold that material. We're seeing a lot of mulchers actually go back to the old ways, the old German ways, which is on the floor. Literally, it's on a concrete floor, and then it's spread out. It's temperature controlled and everything else, but on the floor it doesn't matter. It's a floor. It's concrete. Nothing's getting through that. So the couple workarounds are either replacing or having second sets of grates, either in the tanks when they're saturating and hydrating the grain, or when they're drying it and allowing it to germinate, or doing it on the floor. Those are the two big workarounds that we're seeing, and not overly expensive. Obviously, if you already have a floor melting, it's not expensive at all. And those grades aren't overly expensive. And the maltsters that we've talked to that have really have gotten behind this, have had no real issue coming up with the manufacturing of those grades. So it hasn't really been an issue. Those are the two big workarounds.
One more question here from Shelby. Obviously, terroir will impact the aroma and flavor of malted Kernza, but could you discuss the general sensory impacts of Kernza in the beer, both before and after malting?
Right. So all the beers that we've really had have all been from unmalted Kernza currently, and so I can only speak to that. And we haven't gotten any malted Kernza on any kind of scale that will allow us to brew with it. But the two impacts, it's body, because when you're going through the brewing process, you are getting the carbohydrates out of the Kernza. But again, these are long chain carbohydrates that are unfermentable by yeast, and so it stays in the beer through the process, through the mashing and the brewing process, and then through the fermentation process, through filtering and everything else. So there's a weight, literally a physical weight that it adds to the liquid, that adds to the mouthfeel, which adds body. And then you're also leaching out tannins and flavors and things like that. And again, you're getting, this is, again, I have to always preface this, everybody's sensories are very different. And so what I get out of it, for me, is I get, you get a spiciness out of it, you get a kind of a breadiness, a really robust kind of breadiness. But then I from my sensory perspective, I get this underlying fruitiness that I find in nothing I've ever tasted before. And if you taste our pale ale, and you taste it next to a Sierra Nevada pale ale, you will see the difference. It is night and day. You get this, on the long route, you get this beautiful fruitiness, you get these beautiful hops, you get this really interesting mouthfeel. And not to bash Sierra Nevada and Ken Grossman. Ken's a great guy, and he's doing a lot of great things. But it's a little bit more one-dimensional. It's not as nuanced. I feel like it's not as heavy. It's not as kind of rounded on the palate. And so I think that's really what it's adding currently. And what I'm hoping that it adds once it's malted are some of those things, and some new things that we haven't seen yet.
Great. Thank you both for your time and sharing with today. That was very useful.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for joining. I hope that you learned something, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow for the final day of the 2020 Kernza meeting.
Let's see you all tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.